All right, we are going to go over Chapter 12, Emotions, Stress, and Health. So, in this chapter, the first module will be looking at emotions. We're going to be looking at how to describe the different type of methods that's used for us to measure emotions, which would include our strengths and weaknesses based on each theory and method. We'll be looking at the James-Lange's theory of emotion, as well as the evidence that relates to it. Additional theories we're looking at is the Schachter and Singer theory. We'll be also looking at how we can distinguish and differentiate between the basic emotions, look at alternatives in talking about our basic emotions, as well as how our emotions relate to moral reasoning. And then finally, in this module, we'll look at emotional intelligence. All right, so psychologists, they most often would measure emotions by asking people, how happy are you? How nervous? And so on. We utilize self reports because it's quick and easy, but sometimes, as we know, self reports don't always give us the answers because it's going to be kind of limited. We really wind up relying a lot on what the person would share with us. Basically, what we'll be doing is we infer our emotions from people's behavior and look at it through its context. So, an example of that would be how we might see someone um, run away. They get scared and tighten up, and then they'll run away. And what we wind up doing is inferring that they may be afraid or fear something. So, in order for us to measure emotion, research has been able to demonstrate measure through our sympathetic nervous system. Pretty much how that sympathetic nervous system arousals would indicate our heart rate, or breathing rate, how there's momentary changes within the electrical conductivity across our skin. You know, the hair raising? Yeah, exactly. So the one thing we do have to also think about, though, is how the sympathetic nervous system is going to help us in terms of our fight or flight response. And these are those responses that would help us know about anger or fear or any other kind of intense emotions. In terms of physiological measurements, it really do not tell us which emotion someone might be feeling at that time. So it is a help as a guide. It gives us indications, but we would also do measures again through asking the person directly. Now, looking at this figure 12.1, it's looking at the autonomic nervous system. And again, you know that the autonomic nervous system is going to consist of the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nervous systems. And usually there's going to be times when they are opposing one another. And then there's going to also be times when they work hand in hand. So really remember that the sympathetic nervous system is helping during emergency situations. And then our parasympathetic is going to be helping with our digestive and those non-emergency functions, like when we calming back down. The autonomic nervous system, remember, is going to be the section of the nervous system that will help control our organs like our heart and our intestines. And in terms of the autonomic nervous system, excuse me, it's going to, with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, it has chains of neuron clusters that would help in our left and our right spinal cords. And this comprises the sympathetic nervous system. And basically, it helps to arouse the body for that vigorous action, that fight or flight that I mentioned. And because it helps increase our heart rate, our breathing rate, sweating, like right now I'm sweating because it's a warm day today as I'm taping this. So the body is on guard. It's like it's hot. It's trying to figure it out. But it helps also with the flow of our epinephrine, which remember, that's also known as adrenaline, by preparing you for any type of vigorous activity that you might face. There's going to be different type of situations that would help to activate the parts of the sympathetic nervous system that would help to facilitate different types of activities. Again, with the parasympathetic nervous system, those neurons will have axons that extends into our medulla and then the lower part of our spinal cord that's going to cluster to the organs. With the parasympathetic nervous system, remember that's that calming type, okay? It helps to keep you in a woosah, if you will. So it decreases heart rate. It's going to help to promote digestion. Make sure that whatever you eat is broken down and it goes flows and turns those nutrients into what it needs for the body. As well as those non-emergency functions, as I mentioned, specifically getting ourselves to calm down to help us to return back to a homeostatic state. Okay, so let's take a look at the James-Lange theory of emotions. According to this theory, pretty much our interpretation of a stimulus evokes the autonomic nervous system and the changes and sometimes our muscle actions. So your perception of these changes might be the feeling of your emotions. James suggested that this situation, like seeing a bear, is going to give rise to the action, which would be hopefully running away. And your perception of the action is going to be the emotion itself. That is, you don't run away because you are afraid. You feel afraid because you perceive yourself running away. Kind of get it? It's the action that's creating the emotion. So, in response to what critics might say, James clarified this point of view. He said, first, you need to appraise your situation. If it's a cage bear, for example, at a circus, you're not going to run. You're going to look at it and go, ooh and ah. But if it appears dangerous, you just might run. Your appraisal of the situation will be that cognitive aspect of the emotion. So your perception of your reaction is going to be what you feel as the emotion itself. That perception will include your muscle reactions, being that you're going to want to run. But it's going to also trigger that autonomic reaction. The heart rate's going to increase. You'll start feeling yourself breathing a little more heavier, and you might sweat and so forth. So it also would include facial expressions. You'll be like, oh, get scared. So just remember, James-Lange theory is that idea that perception of bodily changes will provide the feeling aspect of your emotion. You'll be hit with the situation. You're going to stop to appraise that situation, think about what's going on, which is that part of that emotion. Then you'll act on that, those physiological and behavioral changes. And then your perception would be the action itself, which would actually create the emotion. Now, in terms of the Schachter and Singer's theory of emotions, here they're talking about how the autonomic arousal will determine the intensity of an emotion, but it really doesn't determine which emotion will occur in itself. We pretty much would identify an emotion basically on how we perceive the situation. Okay, so it's not pretty much, they're kind of on the opposite of what James-Lange is saying. You're going to not just praise it, but it's going to be the emotion itself that allows you to think about what's going on in its turn. So now, how many emotions do we experience as human beings? Are there just a few basic emotions that combine to form other experiences? Well, in psychology, there's been proposals that there's a short list. Some psychologists have suggested a short list of emotions like happiness, like being angry or sad, having fears, being disgusted, or even surprised. Whereas others, there's even more like contemplations, feeling shame, guilt, having interest in something, hope, pride, feeling relief, getting frustrated, being in love, or enjoying or having an awe about a particular situation, boredom or jealousy, regret, as well as embarrassment. So, what happens is we try to decide what basic emotion we may possess through the following criteria. Basic emotions should come about early in life without requiring most of the experiences that we go through. Basic emotions will really be similar to how it would be across different cultures. So they're not going to be exactly the same for everybody. Each basic emotion would have a distinct physiology, and that basic emotion might even have its own facial expression. So here's a great example. A lot of times people think I'm angry because they're looking at my facial expression, when I might be just indifferent. But because of where I grew up, New York, most New Yorkers are considered to be rude, considered to be always angry, always upset. And that's not the case at all. It's not that we're always angry or upset. We might be more on guard. And we were raised to kind of try to keep a more flat affect, so to speak, where you really don't show much of emotion anywhere. And for some people, they interpret it as being upset or angry because I'm not smiling all the time, or I'm just, see, I do try to smile more now as I've gotten more seasoned, but you get the drift. So when we talk about facial expressions, take a look at this figure here, figure 12.11. Ekman used these faces during an experiment in which he wanted to see how people would recognize those emotional expressions. And based on them, can you tell how a person feels? So when we're trying to understand facial expressions, we kind of identify someone's emotions through their context, their posture. We look at the touch, the tone of their voice, as well as gestures, and not just the facial expression alone. So just because I'm not smiling all the time doesn't mean I'm not happy. I can still be happy without showing a smile. Okay? Throughout the world, there's going to be different ways of expressing oneself, and those emotional expressions will be different for each person. But let me say it this way: we'll seldom recognize an emotion from that facial expression alone. You got to kind of connect those dots and consider, like I said, if I'm sitting up and I'm not smiling, does that necessarily mean that I'm feeling angry or depressed? Or if I'm not smiling and I'm hunched over and I got my head down and I'm not looking with you with direct eye contact, could you now tell that I might be feeling a little differently than if I was sitting up and smiling like most people would want to expect? You have to look at all the pieces of the puzzle. You don't want to just be connected to saying, okay, her face, she's not smiling, means she's upset or angry or sad. You have to also go through reading between the lines, so to speak. How do I sound? Do I sound like I'm angry? Do I stand and sit like I'm angry? You have to take all of these different things into account. All right, so, uh-oh. Computer is doing something, but let me go on. When we're talking about the indications of basic emotions and looking at facial expressions, research has demonstrated that people throughout the world do recognize facial expressions like joy, sadness, and fear, anger, surprise, and so on. And they usually can tell pretty well. Everyday situations, most expressions will show a mixture of different emotions. So if we take photographs of spontaneous everyday expressions, usually someone observing it, they would often disagree with one another because they might see one emotion in their face in which they don't see always be in agreement with what the other person in the photograph was actually experiencing. Another thing to look at is the ability for people to recognize expressions of six emotions that could not tell us whether people have precisely those six basic emotions. So people there with they can with a little less accuracy be able to identify expressions like contempt, which is a little different from disgust. People might also be readily able to identify expressions of someone's feeling pride because of their facial expression as well as their posture. So it's that ability to be able to identify an expression is kind of helpful in our evidence to determine basic emotion. And because of it, it allows us to grow that list. Also, we need to know and understand that we're able to readily identify facial expressions when we're talking about things like sleepiness, if somebody's dragging in their heads or feeling confused. You kind of look at somebody and they're like, they give you that kind of look. Although we'll probably not just readily classify it as an emotion. So pretty much the fact that we can recognize facial expressions like surprise and disgust is really not going to be strong evidence in regards to how one is feeling or their emotion. Now, here in this particular figure, we're looking at a circumplex model of emotion. And instead of basic emotions, we might regard emotions as a series of dimensions. And according to the circumplex model, emotions are going to be range on a continuum, that being from pleasure to misery, as well as along other continuums such as arousal to sleepiness. And know that you're not always going to be fixated on one particular emotion at a time. I might start out really happy, but if something changes in that situation, that happiness can shift and move into where I might show and demonstrate anger. So we're not stuck or static in an emotion. It's dynamic. It can change and move continuously. Now, when we talk about emotions, we have to know that it's useful for something, or why even, look at this in the first place. We wouldn't have to evolve the capacity to how we feel them. One function would be that our emotions would focus on our attention on important information. Pretty much you'll see your eyes gain attention to something. You might turn at once toward the image of something that can evoke strong emotions. I don't know about you, but when I watch television, for example, you can tell through my facial expressions, my body language, how I might be feeling. If a movie, for example, really touches my heart, I might just start tearing. I call it being mushy. But I start getting really emotional based on that image. It's and that's what that strong emotion would be. Even if you're trying to pay attention to something else, sometimes if that emotion is strong enough, it's hard for you to filter and go from one thing to the other. You'll be more in concentration of that initial item or task or image. Our emotions and moods, they can adjust to our priorities pretty much. So if you're running away from mugger, for example, or if you saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I know that's an old movie, but it's a scary movie. And you're running away from them because he has that chainsaw coming at you, you're not gonna stop and want to smell roses. You might notice the rose, but you got somebody trying to kill you behind you. So you're not gonna go into wanting to stop and smell those roses. Instead, even when you're in a happy mood, you might expand your focus, but it's dependent on the situation. According to Fredrickson's broaden and build hypothesis of positive emotions, a happy mood will increase your readiness to try out new things and different opportunities. Uh, it might help increasing your creativity and allows you to notice different details in a background that you might ordinarily overlook, as well as it'll help you to look further and go into pursuit of new experiences that's going to help you to stay in that happy mood. Now, when people make moral decisions, they often make a quick emotional decision. And then what happens is they'll look for an explanation after. That emotional guidance usually works. Usually. Our emotional reactions generally is going to be quick to be able to guide us to making a decision that's usually going to be right. Not always, but usually. So now, people with damage to the prefrontal cortex, they're not going to be able to, or they can't always imagine a feeling of good or bad after various outcomes or situations. Therefore, they don't really consider the emotional pain that a decision may cause. So you want to also realize that how our brain is functioning, if that prefrontal cortex has been damaged in any way, it actually has a lot to do with how we'll feel emotionally. All right, so let's now talk about and look at emotional intelligence. Causal observations in everyday life would suggest that reasoning about emotional topics is going to be different from reasoning about anything else. And there'll be some people who know the right thing to say or be able to help make someone feel better. And then there's going to be some who can't do that. Those who can, though, might notice subtle signals within someone's facial expressions that would indicate they need reassurance or they might need appraisal and a pat on the back. That person might know when a smile is going to be really more sincere or if somebody's faking, like here, an example. Which one do you think is a genuine smile compared to a fake smile? Now, other people, they're going to have their own techniques and be smart in their particular ways. And sometimes they might be clueless to an emotional situation. Psychologists, therefore, have looked at emotional intelligence. And the emotional intelligence pretty much is the ability to perceive, imagine, and understand emotions, and to be able to use that information when you're making a decision. So right now I'm going to stop this video here, and the next video or next conference lecture we'll start talking about how to survey our emotions. On that note, have a good one.